So thank you very much everyone for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to this session on analytics for Digital Earth. This session has been organised by my colleague Vinnie Davies, sitting over here, along with Marion Scott and myself, Claire Miller. We're in Statistics and Data Analytics at the University of Glasgow. So this is an overview of our session this afternoon. I'll start off just by giving you an introduction to the activity that we've organised in this space, and then I'll pass to our two main speakers for this afternoon. We have Richard Reeve from the University of Glasgow and Kevin Wilson from Newcastle University. We'll then wrap up with a summary of the workshops that have taken place in this theme, and Vinnie will give us that summary. We're going to leave all the questions and discussion until the end of the session. We have planned for time for a good discussion panel. So please, if you do have questions or discussion points, if you add them onto the app, then we can track that as we're going through and we can ask them to our panel at the end of the session. So the background to this session is the RSS Mardia Prize. So this prize encourages cutting-edge, interdisciplinary work, specifically bringing together statistics with other science communities. And the prize is to specifically support workshops within this area. So in 2021, Vinnie submitted a very successful application and won the Mardia Prize in 2021 on a theme of a digital Earth. And the EU Science Hub have this nice quote for a digital Earth, describing it as an interactive digital replica of our entire planet, where we want a shared understanding about relationships between the physical and natural environments and, of course, society. So, as we all know, data and analytics play a key role in this, and so we were very interested to have this as our theme and to develop workshops to bring together non-statisticians and statisticians to explore this space. This is the full team from Glasgow. So Vinnie, I mentioned, we've also got Andrew in the audience, Mu, Xiao-Chen, Janine, Marion and Ruth, and others in Glasgow, including Jethro, have joined our team now as well. So to say a few words about our Digital Earth theme and agenda. Specifically, what we're thinking of today is digital twins. And of course, for a full Digital Earth agenda, we're going to need a federation of digital twins that look at all different parts of Earth ecosystem and processes. What do we need for this? Well, we need to think about numerical models. We need to think about data, and that's from a dynamic point of view so that we can consistently update our models, and of course, a way to handle uncertainty within this framework. So this is our Digital Earth theme. We were specifically interested in digital twins. How do we bring together knowledge from physical, biological, chemical processes within numerical models with new and emerging data streams to help us learn from data and understand about our full Earth ecosystem processes? This is specifically relevant for all of us with our AI Cubed initiative that we have at Glasgow of analytics, inference, innovation, and impact. So we're interested in how we study new and emerging data streams, what we can infer from those environmental data, how we integrate it and assimilate it to think about digital replicas, and of course the impact. So how can we actually use this to help regulators, scientists, and so on really understand our processes? So that is all the background to our workshops. We wanted to develop workshops to pull together the non-statistical community with the statistical community in this digital Earth space, form a network right across the sectors, identify subsystems within the framework to study, to look at challenges and needs, and really to think about the wider needs and interests of a digital Earth consortium. The workshops themselves were tailored to interests of the participants through online questionnaires and through discussion at our first workshop. And we've had about 30 to 40 participants, either online or in person, in the Advanced Research Centre at the University of Glasgow. So we've had 4 workshops to date. The 5th one is on the 9th of October. So if you're interested to join us on the 9th of October, you can register at the QR code here, and Vinny will advertise that later as well. But in the other workshops that we've had, we started with a general discussion. We then looked at digital twins for soil carbon, for water, and then more broadly thinking about how we design digital twins. And that brings us directly on to today. So today for you, we've got 2 fantastic speakers that we had at our most recent event in June on designing digital twins. And the first person I'm going to pass over to is Richard Reeve. Richard is Professor at the University of Glasgow and is going to tell us about digital twins for biodiversity.
Thanks, Claire. So I should say to begin with, I work in an ecology department. My background, my PhD was in AI, but stats is definitely not my forte. So I came to this problem about 10 years ago, trying to understand a problem that was put to me by a collaborator at the Natural History Museum who works on the sampled red list index for plants. And he wanted to know, unsurprisingly, given his role, what plant species are most endangered, how we identify them, how we identify the ecosystems they live in. It's all spiraled a bit out of control since then. So, which is the kind of where I'm going to go with this talk. A lot of this work is Claire Harris's, who couldn't be here today, her PhD on simulating global plant biodiversity, and then a couple of grants from NERC on focusing on the UK on simulating UK plant biodiversity and looking at the impact of land use and climate change. So this was the original question. What are the most threatened plant species? And it seems like a relatively easy question because you think that it's the ones that we can't find properly. But that turns out to be a much harder question to answer than I was hoping, and certainly than Neil was hoping, because he was really hoping that I'd be able to give him an answer sometime back in 2012, and we're still working on that. So one thing we looked at first in a grant that we failed grant proposal, I should say, that we call Bees from Space. I was very disappointed that wasn't funded. Was what are the most threatened ecosystems? So can we actually identify the ecosystems using satellite imagery? Because that's nice and simple. We understand satellite imagery. And it turns out you can identify ecosystem types from space, which is great. And so we thought that was a kind of good start, that we can identify where the forests are and where the water is, where grasslands are, and so on. But unfortunately, when you look at the work that Neil had been doing on where you find the threatened species, actually you find them in all ecosystems. Well, technically, you find them in all ecosystems apart from artificial terrestrial ecosystems, which is possibly not surprising. So we had to kind of give up on that approach quite early. But then we started looking at the plant records. So there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of plant records out there, all collated by GBIF these days, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And so you can download them all. And this is what you see. This is on a log scale, the brightness. All of the plants that have ever been recorded are in Europe, really, it turns out. And perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised about that, but it is a bit depressing when you look at where the plants actually are. And so this is, again, satellite imagery, looking at its Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a bit like NDVI, for those who know that. But it basically looks at greenness to see where you can find plants. And the connection between where we've actually looked for plants and where the plants are isn't great. So that turned out to be a bit of a hopeless approach as well. And so to answer the question, where are the most threatened plant species, what we realized relatively early on, after a couple of years, is that the centuries of existing plant records out there are hopelessly sparse and biased, and we can't even use them to find out where species can be found. So then you look at what people have done with the data that is available, and generally they use some fairly simple statistical models to identify what habitat preferences those species are, and then they map out where in the world has that habitat, and they will say, okay, well, those species can survive in those habitats. And so then they do a lot of judgment based on how large the potential habitat is for this species, and then they look at climate change scenarios and say, well, has that habitat moved? Is it moving too fast? And they can do a little bit of extrapolation from that. And that's, loads and loads of people have been doing this for decades. I don't want to knock it too strongly, but there is a big problem here that there are lots of other species in these habitats, and this tells us nothing about whether or not the species you're looking at will outcompete the species you're interested in. And so that brought us quite quickly onto digital twins. And when I say quickly, I suspect it took us about 5 years to get to this point, but it felt quickly to us onto the idea of digital twins. And when you look for digital twins, you quickly discover that there aren't any, not for plant biodiversity. There are a handful of very, very limited, very focused ones looking at individual small forest patches or areas of peat bog and things like this. But at a large scale, looking at individual species, so the Mattingly model is a classic digital twin, but it has terrestrial autotrophs as all plants on land. That's one group that covers all of that. And you have JULES, so the Joint UK Land Environment Simulator that's used by the Met Office, but it has less than a dozen plant functional types. So it doesn't look at individual species. It can't look at species under threat because it just has broadleaf trees. And broadleaf trees as a whole are not under threat. So Claire and I designed Ecosystem, which is written in Julia, and to basically model how the ecosystem impacts species, how the species then reproduce, die, survive, disperse seeds, and how that ecological model then feeds into subsequent the future of these things, and how that impacts, in principle, how that can impact water and soil water availability and so on going forward. So this model is a few years old now that we've been working on, but there's another problem. So here we've got this model in a little bit more caricatural form, and we have our ecological model. We've taken that model from the literature. We have our landscapes at UK level or at individual site level even, or at continental scale. So we're looking at the whole of Africa here. You could do it at global scale, but to be honest, plants don't tend to travel very much between continents, so we tend to look at it at a kind of continental scale. And then the first trick was to make it computationally efficient. So we can now run that on thousands of cores, and it's basically 100% efficient when we go out to at least 100 cores, which is great. So we can run these continental scale models at speed on HPC. So that was what we were aiming for in this initial project. But then it swiftly became obvious that we were in real trouble there because we didn't have any of the data to feed into it. So we had a bit of data on where the plants can be found. I mean, hundreds of millions of records, still only a bit of data compared to the trillions and trillions of plants out there. But worse than that is the fact that we're looking at maybe 400,000 plant species, and each of those species need to be individually parameterized. And so there's an enormous amount of data that needs to be extracted from the literature. Fortunately, there are a lot of real obsessives out there, I'm not talking about statisticians here, who care about every single individual one of these species. And so there are hundreds of thousands of corresponding papers about individual species describing, in Latin mostly, how these species behave and what kinds of species they are. And where that information is missing, then we're now working with Emily, a new PhD student, on the phylogenetic inference necessary to fill in the gaps in this work. So we started off here. And we basically, first of all, we went to this point. I'm going to zoom in on that, hopefully. So where we're taking climate data and we're taking all these plant records and we're cross-referencing them to produce tables to tell us, as the individual species people do, to look at what kind of climate these species can tolerate. So that works complete, and we have that information for at least tens of thousands of species. And that gets us, that feeds in an awful lot of the parameterization into the model. I mean, it feeds in, say for instance for Africa, we're looking at about 50,000 plant species. So that gives us about 200,000 parameters that we feed into the model on different climate preferences that they have. But that's still, so that produces this model telling us where we expect to find, this is species richness across Africa after running this, reconstructing the whole of the 20th century from climate reconstructions and plant models. And this corresponds pretty well to where you actually find biodiversity, except an area over here, which turns out to be the capital of Nigeria and doesn't have very many plant species any longer, because we didn't have any kind of urban model in there. And you can see there's absolutely nothing up here in the desert, but on the coast we still see some species richness. So then we need to know what kinds of species we have, though, because this wasn't taking into account what kinds of species we had, how they grow, how big they grow, anything like that. And so there's a huge amount more. So this is now coming into the literature that I was talking about. And this is now another huge challenge where we're essentially looking at all of this information about every species to try to understand how does it disperse seed, so how fast can it move by reproduction. Obviously, sadly, no triffids involved. So how fast can it move? How fast if we do see these big climate change effects, will this species be able to disperse far and fast enough to move into zones where it can still tolerate the climate? And then we do more phylogenetic analyses to fill out that box, as I was briefly saying, and then we feed all of this back in to this whole model. And so now we've got all of this climate data, the hundreds of millions of plant records from there. We've got hundreds of thousands of papers potentially from here that we're doing natural language processing on to extract these parameters. We're doing phylogenetic inference, and then we're feeding all of this into the same model that we had before. And so now we're up to millions of parameters potentially, but we're still wildly, wildly under-parameterized compared to how complex this model really is. And at this point, I'm going to talk about something on a much smaller scale, because this is somewhere where we can actually solve it. And so we need a bit more of a model now. So we're feeding in a hydrological digital twin. Well, we're currently just using our own simple one, but we're now collaborating with somebody who builds a hydrological digital twin to feed that into it. And this is a peat bog in mid-Wales. So this is just a few kilometers across, a tiny, tiny patch. It's exactly the same model. It's just zoomed right in down to an individual model here. And this is this color scale is soil moisture content of the peat bog. And so these areas around here that are very bright are the wettest areas, and these are dried out parts of the bog that are being colonized by other plant species. So at this scale, where we're talking about maybe 50 species, something like that, we can fully parameterize it. But when we start to scale out, it all falls apart again. And I'd love that this was a story where it had a happy ending and we've finished it all, but really we haven't, and there's still an enormous amount to go here on this. But I'm just going to look at this peatland example. So there's one more thing, which is, unfortunately, for us to get traction with the government, we also need an economic model. So that's just another digital twin we need to add in to this that we are talking to people about, but we haven't quite got there yet. So this peat bog that I was talking about, called Fotno, it's one of the best preserved peat bogs in Wales. It's just on the west coast of Wales, in mid-Wales. And when you look at peatland models, they're often missing from large-scale climate models even though they consume a lot of carbon, they capture a lot of carbon. And the peatland-specific models, they often don't have much about plant diversity. They're really looking more at, is it capturing carbon? Because that's obviously a very important feature of peat bogs. So our model does capture both of those aspects, and so we went out there to visit the peatland experts who are here. This is Natural History Museum as well, and this is me standing at the back going, looks a bit like grass, but it's very wet. So this is the area we're looking at next to Borth, and this is the RSC. So this is this one site. It's, as I said, a few kilometres across, and to get this to work, we need to add several more aspects into our model. We needed to add multiple growth stages into the species. We needed to add an environmental feedback loop so that if a tree colonizes an area, it will suck up a lot of moisture and dry out the bog even further. So we needed to add more hydrological features about how the water spreads, and we're now working to incorporate somebody else's hydrological model into this so it's more accurate. And then we needed all of this trait information we've extracted from the literature, and we needed that validated. We needed the soil, land use, elevation, climate data, all from different sources, many of which come from their own digital twins, but focused in on this site level. And what we end up with is something that looks a bit like this. So we end up with the blue area here is the actual peat bog, and this is just the raw data that we're getting from our collaborators. And then there are areas with woodland and arable land and so on and so forth. And then over here, what we have is where they dug drainage ditches so that they could try to plant on the peat bog a few decades ago. This was a bad thing. So as a result of that work, a lot of these peat bogs are drying out extremely fast, and what's happening is they're being colonized by shrubs and by trees. And unfortunately, the shrubs and particularly the trees, they like it dry, so they can't get into the area until it becomes a certain level of dryness, but once they get there, they suck loads of moisture out of the soil, and so they just make the situation worse. And so this is our model. Sorry, the whole talk is only 25 minutes, so I'm whizzing through this whole story here. And what we have is, these are the drains that you can see the horizontal lines going across, and this is what happens in terms of how well preserved the peat bog is. Bright is well preserved. If we leave the drainage as it is, or if we block the drains so that the peatland can re-wet itself. And you can see that, hopefully, that this is significantly wetter. Well, sorry, not wetter. This is significantly has significantly more moss on it in this scenario where we block the drains without the drainage than it is with the drains. However, unfortunately, this is a climate model where we just repeat the last decade over and over again. If we actually use what the climate forecasts are for the next 70 years, then it all goes wrong no matter what we do. But things are better if we block the drains. So at least it's capturing that correctly, we hope. But you can see that whilst it's better, it's still nowhere near where we currently are. This area will get much, much worse as a result of climate change. And it's not clear to us at the moment, at least, what on earth we can do to protect it against current climate change scenarios. So just going back to this, we've got a huge amount of data going into this model, and this is the output at the end of how wet this peat bog is. And I think it's very pretty, which is why I selected it. That's not really a very good reason, but it's good enough. And the question is, where did this come from? Because there's an enormous amount of data that I've been describing going into this, and all of this project turns out to be about data. And so what we've actually had to do is to build a data pipeline for managing, traceably managing data. And this has been with STFC support. This previous stuff was NERC and EPSRC. But STFC have funded us to do this work. And we basically have a pipeline now to automatically trace all the data that goes through our models as it's being used, and tracing it all the way back to the DOIs of the original source data products that it came from. And so the origins of this image basically described in this horrible graph here. So this isn't my fault. This is W3C. This is their PROV ontology. So here's that plot down here which comes from a computational run that's described here, which comes from a whole bunch of data sets, which used a whole bunch of data sets that you see here, which then came from their own individual computational runs, which then came from a separate set of data sets, which you see here, and then these are the authors at the top with the yellow lines attached to them. So we can kind of zoom in on this, and I'm just going to skip through this very quickly. Here's our plot of the peat and water levels, and you can kind of zoom across, and you can, this is all hyperlinked automatically, so you can click through and see the code run, see what Git repository everything ran on. You can then go back to the sources of the data input from that model, and you can see the data products that we use there. And then you go back to the runs that generated those data products, and you can go back from there to the data that came from. And that takes you back to the people who generated that data. And for instance, in this case, what we've got is that this data came, you can hardly see that, but this data came from CEH. So we can see, so we can trace all of that stuff back to its origins. And the critical point here is that we know these models are going to be wrong, and they're going to be wrong in so many different ways. And when we take them to the ecologists working on these sites, they're going to be able to identify things are wrong, and they'll want to know, why on earth did you think that that species was going to survive? And we need to be able to trace back through these graphs to say, okay, well, actually, our information about that species came from there. And is the problem that that data source is wrong, or is the problem that our NLP algorithm is extracting the wrong information from that paper, or what? You know, we need to be able to do this because we're constantly wrong. So that's really what I wanted to say. I'm struck by the fact that, so this morning I was reading something, I'm going to paraphrase because it was a little bit too rude perhaps for this, for this conference, but I was struck by something that I read this morning from an author in the Global South saying, we're already screwed. Frankly, this idea of being screwed in the future is a luxury good that we don't have. You know, at the moment, in the UK, we're not quite screwed, probably. But we act as if it doesn't matter, and all of this stuff, you know, if we don't keep track of what's going on here and we don't try to mitigate it, we're all screwed. And just trying to connect all of these systems is so complex. Trying to get this, I mean, this has been 10 years' work for our group, but there's vastly more work out there than there are possibly people to do it. And there's just no interest, really. You know, people pay lip service to the idea this is a good idea, but the amount of work that's required to try to understand what's going to happen in the UK, which is one of the best, probably the best studied place in the world, trying to understand what's happening. Never mind what's happening to biodiversity in other countries. You know, we're absolutely doomed. Anyway, so we need an enormous amount of data. And basically, my take-home message from this digital twin work that we've been doing is that we just need data and more data and more data. We need data on the landscape. We need climate reconstructions. We need the climate predictions that Met Office and others are making. We need that digital twin working, and we think we're getting somewhere with that, but it's so data hungry. We need an enormous amount of data from archival records. We need really good algorithms to extract that data. We need phylogenetic inference to connect, to fill in the missing gaps. We need botanical experts to validate the data as well. We need inference within the model. We haven't even started that yet. That's our plan for next year, to fit parameters that we can't extract from the literature. And we need this detailed tracing of what data we used, where, when, and how, because we know that the model is going to be wrong. Any model, particularly a model with millions of parameters like this, in such a complex system that people scarcely understand even when you sit them down and talk to them about it, never mind when you ask them to actually write out a formula for what's happening. We know that it's going to be wrong, so we need to be able to trace everything that happens so that we can identify where we're screwing up. So the data pipeline work has been a huge amount of work from a lot of people all over here. It was originally funded by the Royal Society, but all of this work's been funded by UKRI as well, by NERC, by EPSRC, and by STFC. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to those who have already put some discussion points on the app. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions or comments, if you want to add them on the app, we'll come back to them at the discussion session at the end. So next we're on to our second main speaker for today, and our second main speaker is Kevin Wilson. Kevin is at Newcastle University. He's a reader there. And Kevin's going to tell us about a digital twin for flooding in particular.
Thanks, Claire. I hadn't realised mine was going to be the optimistic talk of the session. So this is joint work on something called the Credo Digital Twin, which I'll tell you about what that is. And it's joint with Jim Smith, who's at Warwick, and Chris Dent at Edinburgh. So I'll start off by introducing the Credo Digital Twin generally, and then I'll hone in on the part of what is quite a large project which we were involved in. So Credo stands for Climate Resilience Demonstrator. So this is a sort of national digital twin funded by the National Digital Twin Programme. And the idea is to think about the resilience of infrastructure networks in the UK to the effects of climate change. Both in terms of what actions can infrastructure network operators take now. So should we build extra flood defences? Should we move our most important sites uphill or to a different part of the country? And those sorts of decisions. But then also, hopefully at some stage, instant decision making. So if we're in a large storm or if we've got a large flood, then can we make real-time decisions to prevent large amounts of the electricity network or the water network or the communications network going down? So these are the sort of aims of Credo. And there's sort of two parts. Well, I think of Credo as in two parts. And the first part is represented on this slide by the picture. So this is the knowledge graph, which is a good name, in Credo. And each of the nodes within this knowledge graph are a physical asset, a physical piece of infrastructure in a particular place. And the place we focused on in year one of Credo was King's Lynn. So these are particular infrastructure assets in King's Lynn. And so each node is either an energy asset, an electricity asset, a water asset, or a communications asset. So for example, there's a primary substation. So this is an electricity asset. And so within that node, there would be all the information about that substation. So A, where it is, B, what equipment is there, C, are there any defenses against extreme weather events? So, for example, flooding, who operates it, what sort of people are there, what are the traditional failure modes, and all these sorts of things about that asset. So within each node, there's lots of information collected by the digital twin. And then we also see the relationships between the different nodes. So the arcs, the arrows, are a physical connection. So this primary substation here is feeding electricity to this secondary substation, which is then feeding electricity to this telephone exchange and this water site there. And so the edges in the knowledge graph are physical connections between the assets. It's passing whatever it is between the different assets. And so this is, as far as I'm aware, unique in the UK because the electricity network know what assets they've got and the relationships between them and how they're connected. But I don't think anyone's gone to this effort before to think about the connected nature of the different networks. And this is important. So if we've got an extreme weather event caused by climate change and this substation goes down, well, then it's quite important to the telecommunications company to know that this exchange is therefore not going to have electricity and this water site is not going to have electricity. So these infrastructure networks are connected, and that's important in terms of thinking about their resilience to extreme events. And so that's one part of Credo. The other part was we wanted to think about how resilient these infrastructure networks are to those extreme weather events. So that involved some what we call the technical work in Credo. So this is really where the universities came in. And so the idea of trying to subject this knowledge graph that we had on the previous slide to some simulated, to some scenarios, some extreme weather scenarios, took these different steps that are given on this diagram here. So the idea was we start by thinking about climate scenarios, and these are the climate scenarios produced by the Met Office that we started off with. So these are the Met Office's climate forecasts. And so think about those climate scenarios, and we then used those within Credo to produce a weather scenario. So we went thinking about, well, let's think about, based on the Met Office's climate scenarios, let's think about a 1 in 10 year, 1 in 50 year, or 1 in 100 year extreme weather event at King's Lynn. The type of extreme event that we decided to focus on was flooding, so I'm going to be talking about flooding for the rest of this talk, but in the second year of Credo, we're now thinking about extreme heat, which is another concern for these infrastructure networks. So we took these extreme weather scenarios, which are essentially rain scenarios, so a 1 in 10 year extreme rain event over King's Lynn, and we had to turn those into flood depths because it would be flooding that would then cause assets to either to struggle and perhaps to fail. So we took the rain fields generated by the weather scenarios and put them into a physics-based model which then produced essentially flood fields in real time from the weather data, the weather events that we've produced. So HIPIMS was produced at the Newcastle University by the School of Engineering. And what that did, that gave us flood depths over the entire length of this extreme weather event. We're typically thinking about a day, 24 hours, over time. And so at every location in King's Lynn, we had a flood depth, and that was a time series of flood depths over the length of the event. So we could use existing models for all of that. And then what we needed to do was turn these flood depths into, well, which of these assets in the network are going to be working at this point in the extreme weather event, and which ones are going to be failed. And this is where we came in. And so our job was to then take this flooding at all of these different sites where the assets were housed and say, is this asset working or not? And we're statisticians, so we didn't just say, is it working or not? We gave a probability that each of these assets would be working at each time point within the extreme weather scenario. So that was our role. And then following on from us, and I'm going to talk about this over the rest of the time that I've got, and then following on from this, there was then an operational research model developed by the University of Edinburgh, and they took essentially our probabilities of failure, and they simulated binary events from them, and then they thought about the cascading failures that could happen in the network from that. So they had an optimization model, an OR model, which then looked at cascading failures, because one electricity substation going down in King's Lynn is not a disaster. If that causes several other assets to go down in the next half an hour, and suddenly we don't have communications or water or electricity for most of King's Lynn, that's a bit of a problem. And so it's these cascading failure that our interconnected networks really needed to be resilient to. So that was what the project was really trying to focus on. So we built the general structure such a demonstrator would take, and then the idea was to apply it to these extreme flooding scenarios. Now, we're thinking about 50 years' time, perhaps, when climate change has had an effect on the extreme weather events in the UK, so they're going to be more extreme. But, of course, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know exactly what the infrastructure in King's Lynn is going to look like in 50 years' time. So we made the assumption, for the purposes of Credo, that the infrastructure would be as it is now. And that gives us an idea about the resilience of the network as it is now, and the idea is then, well, we could change that within the digital twin and see what effect changing that infrastructure would have. So if we built a different substation somewhere else and connected it in a different way, we could look at these sorts of what-if scenarios once the digital twin was working. So what models did we have within Credo? So we needed a model of how an asset might fail in a flood. So we didn't have lots of nice observational data available to construct this model. So King's Lynn, in spite of it being the place chosen for the demonstrator to be initially developed, hasn't had a lot of extreme floods over the last sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So we don't have loads of data where lots of the assets failed and some of the assets didn't fail in order to base our model on. And similarly, although there have been extreme floods which have taken out infrastructure, so obviously York near here, the river floods quite often and it has taken out infrastructure before, we don't typically have lots of data on the failure modes and observational data on exactly what the flood depths were when the things failed, and the sorts of granularity of data we would need in order to build a model just from data alone. However, each of the organizations we were working with, and BT owns the communications network, Anglian Water, the water network, and UK Power Networks were in charge of the electricity network we were talking about. Each of them have teams of people whose job it is to think about the resilience of their networks to flooding, for example. And they're the people who are in charge when the flooding hit York and they had to deal with their networks. Not Anglian Water's case. They don't go as far as York. And so they do have people who have knowledge about what failed and what worked in previous floods and what the failure modes were and those sorts of things, but we don't have that recorded in a spreadsheet or a database in a nice tabular form that we could build a model from it. And so how did we build a model for how these assets might fail in an extreme flooding event? Well, we asked the people who knew. So we conducted structural elicitations with each of these different asset owners, so 2 each, with engineers from BT, people from Anglian Water, and people from UK Power Networks, and we asked them, in a flood, what happens? What do you do? So what sort of notice do you get of the flood? If you get good notice, what do you put in place? If there's water pooling outside something that you don't want to fail, what actions can you take to try and mitigate that? What are the sorts of failure modes that you would expect to see if water gets into the asset? And what are the knock-on effects of this? So in each of the elicitation sessions, we're trying to focus on all the relevant events which affect whether an asset would be functioning within a flood. And from this, our plan was to initially build a single model as a Bayesian network, which was for some generic asset in one of these 3 networks, and how we would go from extreme flooding event to either failure or not failure of this asset. So how can we assess the probability that this asset would have failed at a particular point in this flooding event? And that's what the Bayesian network was going to tell us. And each class of asset, each individual asset will be, of course, different and should have its own individual model. But initially, we wanted a single unifying model structure, which had everything in it. And then the idea was we would then refine this, first of all, for classes of assets, so for example, an electricity substation, but then perhaps for individual assets if necessary later on. So the initial generic model was this Bayesian network here. So this was the result of the 2 rounds of structural elicitation, 6 in all, 2 with BT, 2 with Anglian Water, and two with UK Power Networks. So I'll draw out some features of this Bayesian network. So it's all predicated on this extreme weather event. And of course, flooding was the main cause of what was eventually going to lead to the failure of the asset, if indeed it did fail. But actually, the network owners sort of agreed that a flood on its own is relatively okay to deal with. It's if it comes with something else at the same time that things tend to happen. Because if you've got a storm at the same time as a flood, then trees start falling over and traffic builds up, and suddenly you can't get to your asset to put in place mitigations if you've got mitigations. Access to the asset becomes difficult. So a lot of the time it's sort of bivariate extreme events that are the problem, and that really is a problem because that's something that's very difficult to model. We can think about models of extreme flooding, but models of jointly extreme flooding and extreme storms at the same time is much more difficult. Other things which are important, well, each of the asset owners have a number of remedies which they might employ to prevent the asset failing in the event that there's floodwater building up outside. So you can bring in temporary flood barriers, sandbags and plastic things, and put them up outside. They also have mobile pumping vehicles, so you bring something out and it starts pumping all of the water out. In the case of a telephone cabinet, you can wrap it in plastic. The water people said that often what they do is take things upstairs if water starts building out. So you've got quite technical things, but you've also got very simple things that you can do. But whether or not you can do these depends on a few things. First of all, it depends on surprise. A flooding event that the Met Office has predicted 48 hours in advance is much easier to prevent things failing in than one that has happened at 1 hour's notice and you didn't know it was going to happen, because you can't then take some of your actions. The other critical thing here is access. So in the case of a flood, not only do sort of things like the roads get busy, but also Anglian Water don't get to decide if Anglian Water engineers can go to their assets. In such a situation, the emergency services take over and they dictate who can go to the assets. And they're not prioritizing the electricity supply or the water supply of the residents of King's Lynn. They're prioritizing life. So they're making sure that people can only go places that are safe for them to go to. And so a lot of the time, there's things that they can do, but the emergency services won't allow them to access their own assets. And so access and permissions from the emergency services are quite an important part of this story. And then typically, eventually, once things get wet, certainly once electrical things get wet, that's the time when you get lots of these failures. Alongside things like indirect threats. So in the case of sort of strong winds, indirect threats could be trees falling on things and power lines blowing over and things like that. So that was our general model. But in order to use it to say the probability that an asset is going to be working or not in a particular time in a flooding scenario, we need to populate that with probabilities. So that's how we quantify Bayesian networks. So we need to quantify the Bayesian network for each asset at each time point in each flooding scenario. So what data did we have available to do this? Well, we had the HiPIMS output. So we had all the flood depths at all the locations at all the time points in the scenario. So we knew all the flood depths. Within the knowledge graph, we had all of the information available on any flood defenses at the asset. So for example, some of them have permanent flood barriers. So any flood defenses at the asset were recorded in a database, and so we had those available. And the other thing we had data on, again, through the knowledge graph, was the connections between that asset, that particular water pumping station, or that particular electricity substation, and everything else in all three networks. So we did have some data, and you can see that these are going to be useful. They're going to inform the probability that an asset is working or indeed has failed at any particular time within a flood. But they're not sufficient. That's not enough information to say how likely is the asset is going to be working in a flood. And so to supplement the data that we had, we fell on experts again, and we did some probability elicitation in order to populate that Bayesian network for a small number of assets in a small number of flooding scenarios. And so I'm going to give a case study now of one of these elicitations that we carried out to give you a flavor of how these things worked. So the example is a water pumping station. So it's an asset owned by Anglian Water. And we had the generic Bayesian network, which I showed you. The specific Bayesian network that, again, we had another set of structural elicitations with the engineers at Anglian Water. And it turned out that quite a lot of the sorts of things that were in the generic Bayesian network weren't applicable to this particular water pumping station. In particular, while they could add some extra protection, they weren't going to, for example, build a temporary flood barrier at this water pumping station. They weren't going to send their mobile pumping equipment to this water pumping station. Essentially, there's a hierarchy in their assets, and if this one was flooded, then everything else is flooded as well, and this isn't the place that they would be sending their temporary flood defenses. So quite a lot of that part of the Bayesian network wasn't necessary for this water pumping station. In terms of the failure modes that this water pumping station might have, well, if any of the electrics got wet in the water pumping station, then that would cause a failure. It then wouldn't be able to operate. The other way that it might fail is if there was power interrupted further up the network, so one of the electricity assets lost power coming into the water pumping station. Well, it did have a backup power, but if that backup power also failed, that would cause a failure. So essentially, we're looking at two types of sort of electrical power failures here with the possible failure modes. So this was the Bayesian network that we needed then to populate using our elicited knowledge from our group of experts. So the probabilities to quantify this Bayesian network, well, first of all, this water pumping station also had a permanent flood barrier, which was 90 centimeters high. I don't know why I'm going like that. I'm taller than that. 90 centimeters high. And so it would fail if water got in over that flood barrier. However, if there was 90 centimeters of standing water outside this water pumping station, you've got all manner of bigger problems than it coming over the top. It'll have failed long before that. So the main failure mode here was that essentially the river that the water pumping station was next to was so high that the pumps within the pumping station couldn't pump out the water fast enough, and water came in through the wet well of the pumping station and essentially came in from the inside. So it didn't come out over the barriers from the outside of the pumping station. It came up from within because it can't pump into the river quickly enough, and the rate of water coming in is faster than the rate of water coming out. So the probabilities we need to elicit, well, first of all, that the pumps in the pumping station were overwhelmed, so the water's coming in faster than they can pump them out. Then the probability that water got into the wet well and then into the building, given that the pumps were overwhelmed. And then the probability that there was an electrical fire, given that water had got into the building. So this was sort of the primary failure mode of this water pumping station. The other way, as I said, is that there's no power coming into the water pumping station, so we needed the probability that the power supply upstream of the station is off. But there was a second possibility here, and that's that power is trying to get through, but the transformer, which is just outside the pumping station, failed. So we also needed the probability that the transformer, which was just outside the pumping station, was compromised. And then we needed backup power not to work for it to fail, so again, the probability that the backup generator fails to operate. And so we elicited these probabilities for this water pumping station for one extreme future scenario. So this was a sort of it was about a 1 in 20-year extreme flooding event over a 24-hour period. So how did we conduct the elicitation? So we had 4 Anglian water experts, sort of high-ups, as I tend to call them, people who are responsible for sort of strategy against flooding and those sorts of things. But also we had the engineer who was in charge of this particular water pumping station, who knew about the situation on the ground and how things actually worked. We had a 2-hour workshop. That's quite a lot of probabilities to elicit in a 2-hour workshop, so we had to do it quickly. And so what we did was we used a simplified version of the Tony O'Hagan's elicitation method, the Sheffield elicitation framework. So in particular, within that 2 hours, first of all, I introduced the scenario and the definitions of each of the probabilities I was going to be asking the experts for. I explained what I meant by probability. It's not the relative frequency in an infinite number of tosses of a fair coin. It's your subjective fair betting odds for whether Newcastle will finish in the top 4 of the Premiership this season. They won't. And then we did a practice elicitation in which I asked them about the distance between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I don't think they'd even heard of Edinburgh and Glasgow because they're based in King's Lynn. And so they found that incredibly difficult in a way that I hadn't expected. Well, is it less than 500 miles? We don't know. And then for each of the probabilities of interest, first of all, I asked them for their individual probabilities and captured them in this very advanced Excel spreadsheet up here. Each of the light green boxes, and then again, each of the light green bars in the bar chart there. We then had a group discussion in which I asked them to talk about why they'd given the probabilities they'd had, what evidence they based that on, how they'd weighed up the different sources of evidence they had, and why they'd come to the conclusion that they did. They then had a conversation between themselves, and I asked them for a consensus probability, which was the yellow one at the end here. And for that one, well, I didn't suddenly expect them all to agree, so I asked them to imagine that someone had sat in the corner of the room, hadn't come in with their own strong opinions, but had listened to the discussion and all the individual experts' probabilities. What would their probability now be? And they seemed pretty reasonably happy to give me that consensus probability. And we went through that process for each of the probabilities that I mentioned on the previous slide. So the results are given in this table here. I won't go through each one in turn. I'll draw your attention to a couple of them. So just as an example, the probability that the pumps would be overwhelmed within this scenario, you see that each of the experts gave this a pretty high probability, and then in the discussion, they came to a consensus, which in that turn was not a million miles away from the sort of average of the 4 probabilities. They moved a bit away from the expert 4's probability. A more interesting one is the probability of an electrical fire if water had got into the building. So in this case, expert 1 gave this a probability of 0.7, and the other 3 experts gave low probabilities, but the consensus probability was 0.7. So in the discussion, expert 1 convinced the other experts of the reasoning that they'd made to come to their individual probability. In particular, at least one of the other experts hadn't realized that an electrical fire, just because there's water around it, won't put the fire out. So we had varying levels of sort of scientific and engineering expertise there. We then had some other probabilities which we needed to calculate the probability of asset failure. So probability of generator failure was formed of, well, the generator had to start successfully for it not to fail, and we had a probability for that. But then this particular asset had a problem in that it was in the countryside, and some naughty people locally came and stole the diesel from time to time, or stole the battery in the backup generator from time to time. And so I didn't elicit individual probabilities for that one because there was only one of the 4 experts who knew about that. And so we need to sort of combine those to get a probability that the generator, first of all, would start if it had diesel and batteries, but also the probability it had diesel and batteries. And then from that, we calculated the probability that the asset would fail. Some of these probabilities we elicited if the flood was lower than the height of the flood defense and if it was higher, so we got 2 slightly different probabilities here, but they're both pretty high. So this was quite an extreme scenario, and it looked like the thing was going to fail here. And that was slightly surprising because essentially the rule of thumb we were using at that point was if the flood depth was high, the thing would fail, and if it was a bit lower, it almost certainly wouldn't. We had a sort of almost a binary event there. And that elicitation showed that we need to be a little bit more careful with our rule of thumb as to when things were working and when they weren't. So to wrap up very quickly, so within Credo and within other digital twins like the one we heard earlier, we're combining models. And this is a really difficult thing to do because these models have their own logic, they have their own assumptions, they have their own granularity, and if you combine them without thinking very carefully about these things, you're going to end up with nonsense at the end. Existing models and data provided some of the stuff here, but not all the things we need. And in that situation, asking experts is often the best thing that you can do. And the way I think about this is experts are just providing you with a different source of data. It's got different properties, but it's just a different type of data. There's my plug for Bayesian analysis. And in the future, we need to scale this up. So that was an elicitation for one asset in one scenario. That's not sufficient, so we need some way of scaling this up. Some sort of statistical emulators are probably the way to go there. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So now what we're going to do is pass over to Vinny. Vinny is going to give us a wider summary of what we heard and found at our workshops, and then Vinny will lead us through the discussion part of the session as well. So, there.
Thank you, Claire. So if anyone has any questions, either for the 2 speakers or generally about digital twins, please go on the app and submit a question or like some of the questions that are already there so we know kind of which ones to focus on. So yeah, I'm going to talk more kind of generally about digital twins and some of the kind of general concepts that we've kind of come up with through the workshops where we've kind of been discussing either individual digital twins or designing digital twins or kind of general frameworks for setting one up. So I will just skip that because definitely don't need that. So we came basically to this kind of list of kind of general challenges that we kind of found to be kind of pretty much on almost every digital twin. So kind of got data collection, fusing data sources, joining digital twins, uncertainty quantification, stakeholders, which we've kind of just heard about, co-benefits, and then kind of decision making. So these seem to come up in kind of every kind of environmental digital twin we kind of discussed, and they kind of came up as kind of joint things that needed to be kind of considered together rather than individually. But we'll just talk about a little bit about them individually, because I think it's kind of more generally than that, it kind of becomes down to the individual digital twin. So we talked quite a lot about kind of data collection. So lots of digital twins require data. Some of them have it, some of them don't. And then some of them had individual situations where they had the ability to collect new data. And one of the things we had is when you're talking about lots of different data sources, you have to decide from which set of, what type of data are you going to collect and kind of how are you going to collect that. So that's quite important, especially for kind of the kind of water models and soil models and that kind of thing. So we've just heard about kind of various of fusing data sources. I mean, this seems to come from lots of digital twins. If you're trying to build in, for instance, weather models, temperature models, climate change models, almost every environmental twin has to combine some combination of them to provide kind of a realistic scenario. And one of the ways kind of we've talked about doing that is through kind of combining digital twins. So kind of we thought a little bit about during the workshops of how you would kind of create digital twins that are usable for kind of other people, and similarly how you'd kind of involve other people's digital twins into your own digital twins. And if we're trying to build this kind of idea of this digital Earth or these kind of individual scenarios, how would you go about joining those together? What are kind of the challenges in that? And all of this kind of makes you think about kind of uncertainty quantification, especially as kind of statisticians, right? If you kind of join 10 models together and each one has its own kind of uncertainty model, how do you kind of propagate that uncertainty through both kind of the data, through the different models, and how does that come to some end kind of simulation where you have some way of quantifying uncertainty over either parameters or kind of simulated scenarios, kind of what's the chance of us being doomed, as Richard put it earlier. And then kind of the thing that I think this is one of the ones I didn't, I guess, particularly think about when I was kind of first starting about this, which is probably a bit silly of me, to be honest, but thinking about stakeholders. We had kind of extensive discussion. A lot of it was kind of focused around sort of farming scenarios. If you're trying to encourage farmers to make particular environmental decisions, there has to be in some sense some reason for them to kind of do this. And you kind of need to find some way of making sure they're kind of involved and enthusiastic rather than kind of feeling like it's a chore. So it's quite, I thought that was quite an interesting one. And the other thing we kind of talked about was kind of this idea of co-benefits. If you were to create these kind of environmental scenarios, how are you going to sell it to different people? There are clearly kind of benefits beyond the main kind of scenario, often with these individual digital twins, with these kind of decision making, and it's kind of important to understand how the decisions you make could either kind of benefit other people or actually, I guess, have a knock-on negative effect about kind of in terms of kind of what the action might choose. And sorry, the final one we kind of talked about was kind of decision making and how you kind of take these kind of complex digital twins and basically put yourself in a position where you might be able to either influence your decision or advise someone on what decision they might make. And we talked a little bit about how you would kind of take one of these really complicated digital twins and then find some way of making a simplified decision. I mean, someone was talking earlier about kind of, they had 2 pages max to make a decision. If you've written kind of, you know, Richard's been working 10 years on his biodiversity digital twin, you've got to combine that into 2 pages. How do you kind of do that? And how do you get that to some system where someone can make a decision? There were kind of a number of other things we kind of came up with. These seemed a little bit more down to the individual scenarios. So kind of, again, managing data, Richard talked about earlier, managing code. If anyone wants to learn about version control, I have a session on Thursday. Visualization and communication, which I believe happened here earlier. So citizen science, so kind of, you know, apps for feedback, so like questions I'm seeing coming in. And various other things that basically seem to come into individual kind of digital twins and maybe just combined with other things. So one final plug for our next event is in Glasgow. We do have some funding if people are keen and need some kind of help getting there. But yeah, there's a QR code, or feel free to give me an email or chat to me at some point after this. So I put some challenges up on the board, but I see we've got a few questions, so we'll probably start with these. But kind of these are some of the things I thought we might discuss if there kind of weren't some questions, but we have some questions, so I'm going to start with those. So we've got, the question is, a full and complete digital twin would be planetary scale. How do you know when enough factors and information have been incorporated? Does anyone want to start with that one?
I could start. I mean, I think the simple answer is there are never enough factors incorporated, but from our perspective, we need to be able to understand. Our ambition is to understand enough about specific sites and then try and extrapolate. And that comes down to where we have data and where we can fit the models, because we can extract these millions and millions of parameters, and we are doing from the literature and from surveys and from archival records. But actually, it's kind of irrelevant how far is far enough when there's no data to parameterize large sections of the model. So what we're essentially doing is we're picking off individual parts, like the peatland example that we had, where we do have enough data. We're parameterizing that fully. We're seeing whether that extrapolates to other sites. We're looking at we're doing it piecemeal. It's not a great answer, but it's really the only answer we have, that we do these things piecemeal and we see where we can extrapolate from and where it breaks down, and then we pick on the next big target. And we just keep doing that until I retire, you know.
So I think it's quite a practical element of kind of, you have to kind of interpret, add in bits and bits, and you know, keep moving towards making it better. And like, I think this is kind of where it's important about joining digital twins and kind of having setups where you can easily use other people's work. So kind of these, you know, there's no point 10 different groups designing the same climate model. If someone's kind of got one really good digital twin that everyone can use, it's kind of important to have this kind of way of joining it all together. So the next question, I guess this is probably more at Kevin. Did you find it easy or difficult to find domain experts that would engage with you?
So in general, it can be very difficult. In this particular project, it was funded, and so the 3 network owners were contractually obliged to provide us with experts. So that made it a bit easier. In terms of the engagement of the experts, actually they all played ball. So particularly in the probability elicitation stage, certainly in the medical context, there are examples where clinicians have refused to provide quantitative information. I think it's perhaps a natural reaction of clinicians who keep being asked, you know, what are my chances, and don't want to give sort of false hope and that sort of thing. But actually, in this context, all of the experts in the probability elicitation sessions participated fully, thought very hard about it, did their best to interpret the evidence, and came up with probabilities, and were perfectly willing to do so, and also engage with the sort of consensus building and the final probability in the end. So we didn't have to recruit experts in that case. When you do, it's trickier. But my experience is that I've never had an elicitation where we haven't had experts, and therefore we couldn't do it. And it's possible, as long as you're prepared to put a bit of work in.
Richard?
Yeah, so I have quite a bit of experience on a number of different levels with consulting with experts, and of course experts is a loaded word to begin with. I mean, everything from the IUCN domain experts on endangered plant species to, we do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, in individual villages, working with rural communities, trying to understand the problems they have. And they're obviously the experts on how they graze their land and how they grow their crops. And the thing that we always end up coming back to is, are we providing anything back? And it's always easy to engage, at least in my experience, it's always easy to engage the interest of a domain expert the first time. It's often possible to do it the second time, maybe the third if they're particularly gullible. But if eventually they just feel like they're being used and you're not providing anything back that they're interested in, then that link's going to fail. And so that's really what we've focused on, is always trying to pull things back. In the case of the project that I was talking about there, pulling it back to, are we helping to identify endangered species? Because that's what our collaborator in the Natural History Museum is really interested in. And he's been extremely patient with us. 10 years on, we still haven't identified an endangered species for him. But he can see that what we're doing is useful, and he can see it's leading in the right direction. And I think that that's the critical part of engaging with these domain experts.
So I think the next one's for me and Claire, I guess. I'll let you go first, Claire, and if not, I'm happy to answer. What benefits did you anticipate/find by taking a more time-consuming approach using workshops over a kind of desk research or a survey approach?
Yeah. I think the main one, and really our main goal with the workshops, was about networking and about building relationships and building collaborations. All of this stuff is really challenging, it's really hard, And what we really wanted to do, and what we're always aiming to do as a group, is really to build strong relationships with, as we're talking about, domain experts, and make sure that we've got the right information going into any study that we do. So that was really the main goal of the workshops. You can't, of course, get that just from a desk-based study. So that was really important. It was really the networking aspect. I think the other aspect, though, has just, we've really benefited from all the discussion and all the questions that Vinny presented in terms of the summaries for the workshops. Probably, if anything, the workshops raised more questions than answers. I think sometimes when you're just doing a desk-based study and looking at the literature, you don't see some of the gaps. Also, I don't think all of the complexity comes across. I think when you're discussing it, it can be much more open and honest about the time that these things take and about the complexities that we need to consider. So for me, I think that's really the benefits of the workshops. In some sense, I think you can argue that actually it didn't take more time. I think getting a lot of different domain expertise in the one room, I think we achieved a lot in each of our day sessions, and there was a lot of learning there that it could have taken you actually a lot longer to get just by doing a desk-based study.
The second thing I'd say is, I mean, at least from my perspective, maybe Claire might have done a better job, but from my perspective, I wouldn't have known what to ask. I have my own digital twins that I'm interested in. I have, various applications, and I know what I'd find interesting there, but I didn't have a general rule about kind of what any digital twin would be interested in. So I might not have asked the right questions. So kind of we're bringing people together with lots of kind of different ideas of kind of what a digital twin is, or not even, so we had a lot of people that didn't even know what a digital twin was, and they came to kind of to find out and to kind of pose their own problems to others to then discuss. And I think for me that was kind of a lot more useful than kind of if we'd have sent out 1,000 surveys and asked people to tick which things they think were important in a digital twin, at least to me. We've still got a bit more time, so we've got the flood modelling. Was there anything other than communication, water and power that you considered to be an asset? Any ruled out? So I guess the same that you Kevin.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the thing that strikes me as being conspicuous by its absence is the roads. Roads are absolutely integral in terms of emergency services, access to things, but they also, they link up to each of these to each of these other networks as well. And one of the things that came up time and time again with the asset owners is, we can do this if we can get through. If we can get to the asset, then we can do this. If we can get the asset, we can put this in place, and we can. And so the roads, I think, are missing. I mean, obviously, the gas network is missing as well. So I think there are networks that are missing. The stage at which we came into the project, all the project partners have been decided. So we didn't have any influence on that. But I think if they were going to do this again, they would include Highways Agency or someone to get the roads in there.
And the final one, which we'll finish after that one, is for Richard. For the biodiversity digital twin, how do you go about building an economic model to aid communication?
So I'm definitely not an environmental economist, and these are people that we've just put in a proposal this year with, and I've never worked with them. But so my answer, apologies if there are any in the room, I know my answer's wrong. But the simple answer is that there's a lot of offset markets being created at the moment, and as well as a kind of carbon offset markets that we're kind of probably broadly familiar with, they're now setting up biodiversity offset markets that allow you to trade off some area where you want to build £1 million houses for some area of wasteland, probably in the northeast of England, that they don't care about. I wish it weren't that brutal, but they really don't care at all about the reality of what's going on here. They just care about making a profit out of the land and selling it for housing. So the simple answer is that what we're trying to do is to take these unbelievably crude and simplistic models where they say well, this rare bird species normally nests here and we want to build our expensive houses here, so we'll just find somewhere else where these birds might like, and we'll put them all in a van and move them there, and hope that that works, and offset against this area to something much more grounded in reality that looks at the biodiversity impacts of remediation efforts that you might do in different sites, and whether the actual net biodiversity, whether there will be biodiversity net gain in this new area versus the old area that you were looking at. And so the basic plan there is to take our biodiversity models and integrate them with the economic models that basically say, okay, well, we'll create a market where, 10 rare plant species is worth 18 quid or something. And we'll end up with something where you can essentially balance the books and say that this is a model where that's financially viable, that will encourage farmers to take part in biodiversity offsetting and things like that. So it's really about creating the financial structure around mechanisms that the government can then legislate for that will make it financially viable for the farmers or the landowners to use their land in this way.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, thank you all for coming. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and thank you to all our speakers for coming and speaking to us today. So thank you very much.